Thank you.
Thanks very much. I acknowledge the traditional owners of country and pay my respect to their elders past, present and future. Before I begin, as my preamble, nothing's more important than beer. So corn, why corn? During the Depression, when during the Prohibition era in the US, alcohol, of course, was illegal. So one way they got around it was to make alcohol out of corn, hence corn ale in the south. So there you go. If you've learnt nothing else today, you've learnt that, and you weren't expecting to. Thank you for having me once again today. In the weeks leading up to the federal budget, it is always instructive to have a close look at the budget submissions of groups like the Master Builders. Your organisation can always be counted upon to cut to the heart of issues affecting infrastructure in this country. And this year, I found myself agreeing with your pre-budget calls for action in areas including housing affordability, red tape reduction and skills development. But particularly, not surprisingly, I was taken by your outlook on infrastructure. And this is what you said. The model for delivery of publicly funded infrastructure must be sustainable and delivered in a consistent way that incentivises a greater participation from both state and territory governments and the private sector. I think that the budget delivered neither stability nor incentive. It delivered cuts, delays, and a funding model for Melbourne Airport Rail that assumes that railway lines build themselves. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak to you today to take you through my assessment of the budget. I assume you've had an alternative assessment just before me, and what our take on it was. In the lead up to the budget, there were a lot of front page stories about big projects coming with big numbers involved. $5 billion seems to be a favoured figure. But when you look at the actual budget papers, there's actually nothing for construction for Melbourne Airport Rail. There's nothing for construction of Western Sydney Rail. You have grants funding falling off a cliff from $7.2 billion in 2017-18 down to $4.5 billion in 2021-22. You have not a dollar of new infrastructure investment, and that's why when you look at the budget papers from 137 to 144 of budget paper number 2, what you see is line after line of 0, 0, 0, 0 and 0 for states, for programs right across the board. To be fair, there were new projects from previously appropriated but unallocated funds. But that funding itself has been pushed off into the never-never. Only 1% of that funding, 1%, is in the next 12 months. And 85 cents in the dollar isn't there in the forward estimates at all. So won't arrive until 2023 at the earliest. And what that means is delays in the important rail and road projects which need to occur right now. If the people of Australia want to see the projects announced in Budget 2018 under construction, they'll have to re-elect the Turnbull government not once but twice before the money actually flows. After the 2017 budget, we asked the Independent Parliamentary Budget Office, it's got a bit of a run this week about its independence, what is the trajectory of infrastructure investment under the current government? And that trajectory shows that over the next decade, infrastructure investment falls from 0.4% of GDP in half to 0.2. Hardly a recipe for growth or jobs. So that's why when you look at the detail when it comes to infrastructure and construction, Budget 2018 was a triumph of spin over substance. And this comes at a time when we need investment now. We know that from Infrastructure Australia that the cost of congestion is some $16 billion a year in lost productivity. Without action, Infrastructure Australia warns that the figure will reach $53 billion by 2031. So we need to invest in our cities, we need to invest in our regions, and we need to invest in our rural areas to make sure that goods and produce can be got to market as quickly as possible. I do want to take the opportunity to talk about what will be a couple of the big distinctions, I guess, in the run-up to the next election. The firstly is off-budget funding. Now, the government has a big figure that they talk about. They never actually can produce projects that add up to that big figure. But it's a big figure over 10 years, not over 4 years, let alone over the next year. But what they have done is more and more try to create a circumstance whereby the overall budget looks better for the Treasurer by having projects with off-budget financing, that is, that don't make a difference to the bottom line in terms of the deficit. So they keep coming up with various proposals to do that. The Northern Australia Infrastructure Financing Facility, of course, the NAIF was one, announced with great fanfare 3 years ago. Still no major projects as a result of that. Once again, $5 billion seems to be the sort of utopia figure that's used for that allocation. I call it the No Actual Infrastructure Fund because it hasn't delivered a single major new infrastructure project. And you in the private sector wouldn't be surprised because the truth is that there's not a shortage of capital available for private sector infrastructure projects which stack up. So the demands on the NAIF, the whole model, was based upon looking for a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. Projects which add up have plenty of capital available at relatively low interest rates in Australia right now. The Infrastructure Financing Unit was another one. That was last year's budget. That was established. No one wanted to work for it. They couldn't get people in there. They've now shifted it across to the Department of Infrastructure. But they actually cut funding for that unit. Came from the $18 million, came from money that had been allocated for nation-building projects. So they took money off road funding to fund essentially bureaucrats in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet to advise on how to finance infrastructure projects when Infrastructure Australia had it and has it in its legislation as one of its core responsibilities to advise on infrastructure financing. And of course, no one can point to, frankly, anything that unit, as I said, now shifted back across to the Department of Infrastructure to anything that it has achieved. This year's idea is that public transport projects can be funded without public investment. I wish I'd thought of that. I would have been able to do a lot more. Now, Melbourne Airport Rail and Western Sydney Rail are both projects that everyone knows. Melbourne Airport Rail has been spoken about for decades. Western Sydney Rail is not just about the airport. Even if the airport was not there, the employment lands to the north of the Badgerys Creek site, that whole corridor between the Macarthur region and the major sort of Nepean Penrith region, with projects like the Science Park, where you'll have some 4,000 units and houses. You'll have 12,000 units, I think it is actually. There, a high-value precinct, the first STEM school, which will go from K to 12, where the agreement's already been signed with Catholic education. Even if the airport wasn't going there, that makes sense in terms of development and making sure that we get it right and that we have the transport linkages before the housing is built, and that you get your social and community infrastructure there as well. That project is necessary. It will take dollars to build it. You can only have an equity investment off budget if it fulfills two criteria. The first criteria is that ongoing revenue has to be higher than ongoing costs. So the costs of maintenance and operating a rail line have to be greater than have to be less than the fares, essentially, that are being collected. That's the way it works. Now, your average public transport project in Australia gets about 20%. Some get up to 25%. That's what the fare box contributes to the ongoing operations of that rail line anywhere in Australia. There are none in Australia, none, that deliver greater than 25%. Now, that's not even taking into account then the fact that an equity injection for capital construction costs has to then pay that back as well. So when you're talking about projects in excess of $10 billion, they have to pay that back at a commercial rate of return. Now, the government's budget strategy will have you believe that that can be achieved. There's no one in this room, no one in the private sector anywhere, who could get that through their boardroom. And that's why Matthias Cormann opposed this strategy as the finance minister, because it simply doesn't stack up. And the concern here then is that in the New South Wales budget yesterday provided no money for construction for Western Sydney Rail either. This is a project that we need to happen, is vital for Sydney, just like the Melbourne Airport rail line is vital. You can, of course, have off-budget financing. We did it for some of the ARTC projects, for example, in the Hunter Valley Coal Network. We did it for Moorebank Intermodal. I support the government doing it for Western Sydney Airport. That's an asset that will then be sold or leased, and it will be leased for more money than the construction costs. It will produce a return. I have no doubt that there will be bidders for it. But you can't base a strategy on thinking that a funding model will just sort of pretend it's okay, because it means that construction won't actually happen. And it's not just me saying this. This is what Adrian Dwyer, the Infrastructure Partnerships Australia CEO, said about the budget. Ultimately, there are only two ways to pay for infrastructure: tickets and taxes. We can't finance our way out of a funding problem. I'm worried that what we might see in budgets is a financial vehicle for a project when that isn't right for the project. And Marion Terrell from the Grattan Institute said, if infrastructure projects are never going to make a commercial return, the government should stop pretending they will. I agree. Simple as that. What would we do if we're in government? Well, the first thing to do is to look at our record. The average annual investment in the nation's infrastructure increased, public and private, from $29 billion under the Howard government to $57.7 billion under us. Per capita transport infrastructure investment went from $132 for every Australian to $265. We doubled the roads budget. We increased the rail budget by more than 10 times. We invested more in public transport than all previous governments combined in the previous 107 years. When we took office, Australia was 20th in the list of developed nations in terms of infrastructure as a proportion of GDP, and when we left office, Australia was first. The next Labor government will continue to build on our record as the party of nation building. And your industry has very much a direct interest, because right now your industry is building the homes our nation needs to meet Australia's strong population growth. You're building houses in the outer suburbs and apartments closer to city centres in terms of urban infill. But you need infrastructure to make sure that our cities are not just productive but livable and sustainable as well. You need that proper planning mechanisms to be put in place. That's why we created Infrastructure Australia. That's why we'll recreate the Major Cities Unit. That's why we'll introduce new preconditions for federal infrastructure grants to better serve the public interest, including the training of apprentices, the use of smart technology, and integration of transport projects with active transport options. I want to see smaller companies as well, particularly local companies, have a genuine opportunity to get a piece of the action. And a Labor government will require states to create such opportunities in contracts that would mean lead contractors reach down the chain to smaller companies. When governments spend large amounts of taxpayers' money on major projects, they take the opportunity to extract the full public benefit. Public benefit is served not only by the completion of new railways and roads, but also by involving local businesses and workers in the delivery of the project. And as a bonus, there's no shortage of evidence to suggest that the greater involvement of mid-tier construction companies leads to savings to the public purse by fostering greater competition. In conclusion, can I say there's an old saying to the effect that if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. I'd like to turn it around into the positive. When you plan well, you're planning for success. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. Your organisation has a proud history, established longer indeed than the nation itself, which is quite remarkable. You've contributed to the building of the nation, and I look forward to working with you, hopefully without that nasty word, the nastiest word in politics, shadow. So I hope that next time I speak to you, that nasty word is not in my title. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. We do have time for a couple of questions before our next speaker. I'm sure I've got a few, but has anyone got any from the audience at all? We've covered beer, so anyone else? Michael McLean.
Anthony Michael McLean, Master Builders Western Australia. I understand the Productivity Commission will be handing down a report soon reviewing the GST distribution across the states and territories.
A GST question from Western Australia?
I thought I'd surprise you. How influential would that report be to the ALP in looking at its position on GST distribution?
Look, we obviously will look at it, but we've preempted it, if you like, by putting the 70% floor policy that I think was the ask, essentially, of WA into practice through a method of providing additional, like on top of business as usual, infrastructure investment, which should be one which pleases this organisation, because what it will mean is that that will lead to additional growth and additional revenues through the additional economic activity that will occur as a result of that. One of the things that I've found and I've been to WA 7 times this year. It's only June, and I'm a regular visitor there, and this week Alga's in town, so lots of local government people through my door. One of the good things I have found about WA is that there are the big projects with Metronet, I think a clear plan in terms of to prioritise public transport to expand the network. But the other thing that I have found, and I'll single out one that because we've funded already, but there's others we're certainly looking at. The plan of the City of Stirling, which is a comprehensive plan about increased numbers, like tens of thousands of increased dwellings, supported by improvements in road infrastructure, a light rail line to Scarborough Beach, a very comprehensive plan that they have in stages to roll out. They've reserved the corridors in the southern region. I've met this week with quite a few, but around the Peel region there's good industry plans to the south of the city. There's a range of really good integrated plans, not just looking at, we want to build this road because people want to go from A to B, but looking at how do you boost employment outside of the CBD, closer to where people live. Perth, I think, for people who aren't from Perth, they think, oh, well, Perth's a sort of medium-sized city. Yeah, it's not that big because it's, less than a third of the size of Sydney or Melbourne, until you drive from Mandurah to Scarborough to a meeting, and then you drive out to the Swan Valley and you realise, because everyone in this great country of ours likes being able to think that they can see the water on the coast, it's such a spread out city. So I think there is some real opportunities for us to use what has been undoubtedly a big disadvantage that WA has suffered because of the way that the GST has worked out, to actually really make some major improvements over the next few years, and they are improvements that will significantly boost your sector in WA.
Thank you. One last question, I think Dave Malone, Northern Territory.
Dave Malone, Northern Territory. The government is one of the largest clients for our industry right across the country, and how it does business not only influences the direct contact with our industry, but also drags the private sector along as well. Do you have any views about how government can be the model client going forward in terms of doing business with our industry? And I'm particularly thinking about risk. It seems today the governments are very keen to dump all the risk onto the private sector. Is there a way of getting to the point where we get a balanced approach, which I think will give better value for money for government as well?
I think it's about, to draw an analogy, I guess, with what I was, another way of looking at my analysis of the government's fiscal approach to getting things off the budget is really about transferring all the risk to someone else as well. That's one of the reasons why it doesn't work. And governments should have an approach. When I was the infrastructure minister, I refer you to a report that we did in 2012, all about encouraging private sector investment, but about the role that the government can play in mitigating risk. And we can certainly do that. One of the things is by working with the private sector, by having certainty in terms of outcomes as well. I think if you look at the sort of policies we're looking at in housing as well, that Doug Cameron has released, there is no reason at all why part of the solution in terms of housing affordability, of course, obviously is supply, but one of the things that the current government has ignored completely is the potential there for direct government involvement in increasing that supply. I say that as someone who grew up in public housing, and think that there is a role in society for public housing, not just welfare housing. There is a role for the government to do that. Lots of people in the private sector participate in, we have whole debates about tax, about individuals participating in the housing market. The idea that the government should completely withdraw effectively is, I don't think, a good one either. And I think the government can play a direct role, but can also play a role in terms of the way that we engage with the private sector to make sure that that risk is mitigated. So, for example, when we're talking about growth areas, part of that is the government's direct role in provision of infrastructure, but perhaps there can be other ways as well of encouraging, particularly in regional centres, and I include Darwin as one of those. We need to take pressure off the big East Coast capitals of Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne in particular. One of the ways that we do that is to encourage growth in the capital cities who are really crying out for growth, but also our regional centres as well.
Thank you. Thank you
Thanks
so
very
much.
much. Thanks
Great.
very much.
Could you extend your thanks to Anthony Albanese? Thank you.